The screen still glowed with numbers nobody wanted to face as the executive team stood up in rehearsed unison. They thought walking out would leave me panicking alone in the dark room. They had no idea their turned backs were the cleanest evidence I needed. The person I called next was not a lawyer, a journalist, or a cop. It was the only person who could torpedo their multi-billion-dollar deal on signing day. My name is Ella Perez. I am 38 years old, and as the Director of System Auditing at Crown Edge Response Solutions, my job was to find the cracks in the foundation before the house collapsed. Right now, I was standing in the dead center of the executive boardroom at our Denver headquarters, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic view of the Rocky Mountains. But nobody was looking at the view. Their eyes were fixed on the projection screen, where the raw, unedited truth about our emergency dispatch system was laid bare. This was not a standard quarterly review. This was the final, high-stakes sanitization meeting before Crown Edge signed itself over to Alder Vale Capital in a massive buyout. There were hundreds of millions of dollars in executive bonuses sitting on the table, waiting to be cleared in less than 48 hours. Every single piece of data I presented had the potential to shatter that payout. The system we were selling to counties and cities across the United States, the digital backbone that routed ambulance, fire, and police responses, was fundamentally broken. When an emergency dispatch system fails, people suffer. It is not an abstract loss of corporate revenue. It is a frantic father calling for an ambulance and hearing nothing but dead air. It is a fire engine being routed to the wrong quadrant of the city while an apartment building burns to the ground. That was the reality of the software we were peddling, covered up by glossy marketing brochures and fabricated technical reports. I clicked the presentation remote, transitioning to the slide that I knew would pull the pin from the grenade. The heading was simple, but the data beneath it was a corporate death sentence. It showed the side-by-side comparison of the uptime metrics we reported to the public and the actual, unscrubbed server logs pulled directly from the engineering backend. As you can see on the left, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the suffocating tension in the room, we have been guaranteeing an uptime of 99.98% to our municipal clients. However, the raw data on the right indicates our actual operational uptime dips dangerously low during peak load times. Worse, the critical security patches required to fix the vulnerabilities in the dispatch routing protocol have been intentionally delayed for over 8 months to avoid triggering mandatory downtime reporting to the regulatory oversight committees. I did not get to finish the next sentence. Grant Mercer, our chief operating officer, did not sigh. He did not slam his hand on the heavy mahogany table. He simply stood up. The movement was so smooth, so utterly devoid of any emotional reaction, that it felt violent in its sheer coldness. He buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, picked up his leather folio, and turned his back to the screen without uttering a single syllable. Then, the person to his left stood up, and the person to his right, like a perfectly orchestrated ballet of corporate arrogance. All 12 of the remaining executive board members rose from their ergonomic leather chairs in absolute, suffocating silence. The air in the room grew instantly heavy, pressing down on my chest. It was a visceral display of power, designed to shrink the walls around me. They were not going to argue with the data. They were not going to ask follow-up questions about the delayed patches or the fabricated uptime numbers. Engaging with the data would mean acknowledging it legally. By walking out, they were attempting a brutal, silent character assassination. They wanted to make it look like I had gone rogue, that I was a hysterical mid-level director throwing an unprofessional tantrum that did not even warrant a formal response. They wanted anyone who heard about this meeting later to think I had simply lost my mind. I stood rooted to the spot, gripping the presentation remote so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins, screaming at me to say something, to demand they sit back down, to throw the binders of printed evidence across the table. But I swallowed the panic. I let the silence stretch, amplifying the sound of their expensive shoes marching across the plush carpet toward the exit. Daniel Kay, the chief financial officer, was the last one to reach the heavy frosted glass door. He paused, his hand resting on the brushed steel handle. He did not turn to look at me completely, only tilting his head just enough to let his voice carry back to the front of the room. Nobody is killing a deal just because one person does not know what floor of the building they're on, Daniel said. His words dripped with a terrifyingly polished venom. It was the kind of corporate cruelty that did not need to raise its voice to leave a permanent bruise. He pushed the door open and stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, letting the heavy door click shut behind him with a terrifying finality. The motion sensors in the room, detecting the sudden lack of widespread movement, automatically dimmed the overhead lights to a low hum. Suddenly, I was entirely alone. The massive room was swallowed by shadows. Save for the glaring bright rectangle of the projection screen, the harsh white light of the doctored uptime numbers washed over my face, reflecting in my eyes. The only sound left in the room was the low, steady hum of the overhead projector cooling fan and the frantic thumping in my own ears. They expected me to break right then and there. They expected me to slide down the wall, bury my face in my hands, and realize that I had just thrown away my career, my unvested stock options, and my professional reputation for a moral high ground that no one else in this building cared about. They expected me to be the devastated, crying loser in a completely rigged game. Instead, I felt my heart rate, which had been hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, begin to slow down to a steady, rhythmic, and terrifyingly calm beat. A strange, glacial clarity washed over me. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dim space as I bypassed my contacts and dialed a secure number from memory. I brought the phone to my ear, listening to it ring exactly twice. Voss, the voice on the other end answered. Crisp, sharp, and totally devoid of pleasantries. I lifted my chin and kept my eyes locked on the security camera lens positioned perfectly above the projection screen. The tiny red recording light blinking steadily in the dark, capturing every single frame. They refused to receive the warnings, I said, my voice steady and echoing slightly in the empty, cavernous boardroom. All 12 of them, and the boardroom cameras recorded everything. On the other end of the line, Naomi Voss did not gasp. She did not ask for clarification or express even a fraction of an ounce of shock. As a senior compliance adjudicator at the trust monitoring this acquisition, she knew exactly what kind of weapon I was handing her. Good, Naomi replied. Her tone was like striking a spark in a room entirely flooded with invisible gasoline. Do not leave the building. The trigger condition has now been met. I lowered the phone and ended the call. A slow, deeply satisfied breath escaped my lungs, pushing out the last remnants of fear. They thought their synchronized power move had stripped me of my credibility. They thought their theatrical exit had rendered my presentation entirely meaningless. What Grant Mercer, Daniel K., and the rest of the untouchable board failed to realize was that I had never walked into this executive boardroom expecting to win an argument. I knew their massive egos would never let them admit fault, especially not with hundreds of millions of dollars waiting at the finish line just 2 days away. I had not stepped up to this podium to change their minds or appeal to their non-existent sense of public duty. I had stepped into this room specifically to trigger their arrogance. I needed them to actively, visibly, and undeniably refuse the critical warnings. And by walking out in perfect unison, thinking they were absolutely untouchable gods of the corporate world, they had just handed me the immaculate, unassailable proof I needed. They had just confidently signed their own professional death warrants, completely unaware that the execution had already begun. I grew up in a coastal town in southern Texas, right on the edge of the water where the air always tasted faintly of salt and diesel fuel. When I was 14 years old, a massive hurricane tore through our county. It was not the high winds that shattered our community, nor was it the floodwaters that swallowed the first floors of our neighborhoods. The true disaster struck in the aftermath. When the rain finally stopped and people needed help, our local emergency warning and dispatch system completely collapsed. My father had suffered a severe laceration from a broken window, and when my mother picked up the landline to dial 911, there was no dial tone, there was no static, There was just an endless, suffocating silence. We later learned that the county's dispatch servers had flooded because the backup generators had not been maintained in over 5 years. There was no sensational Hollywood tragedy in our living room that night. My father survived, but I never forgot the absolute, chilling reality of that silence. I saw firsthand how a single point of failure in a digital system could strip a community of its safety net, leaving terrified people completely blind in the dark. That single experience dictated the entire trajectory of my life. It pushed me away from lucrative jobs in commercial software development and pulled me toward the unglamorous, highly scrutinized world of digital infrastructure auditing for public utilities. I became the person who inspected the invisible plumbing of civil society. Over the course of 15 years, I built a solid reputation in the tech industry. I was known as a pragmatic fixer. If a municipal contractor had a dirty procedural habit or a messy codebase, I did not immediately run to the press or the federal regulators. If the company showed a genuine willingness to self-correct, I would roll up my sleeves, sit with their engineers for 60 or 70 hours a week, and help them rebuild their systems from the ground up. I fixed things quietly. Crown Edge Response Solutions knew all of this when they recruited me. They took me to a 5-star steakhouse in downtown Denver, ordering expensive wine and selling me a beautiful, meticulously crafted narrative. They told me they were expanding across 30 different states, acquiring municipal contracts at a breakneck pace. They claimed their growth had simply outpaced their internal governance. Grant Mercer sat across from me, looked me dead in the eye, and told me they desperately needed a director with an uncompromising moral compass to tighten their compliance standards before a massive national rollout. I wanted to believe them. I walked into their corporate headquarters on my first day and let myself be thoroughly persuaded by the polished aesthetic. The walls were lined with frosted glass. The executive suites featured flawless, real-time data dashboards displaying green check marks across every operational metric. The leadership team spoke in perfectly curated sentences, using the exact ethical buzzwords you use when you want to borrow the concept of integrity to sell municipal peace of mind. They told me my predecessor, a man named Ronan Bell, had abruptly resigned due to severe professional burnout. In the high-stress world of emergency tech, burnout is a common casualty, so I accepted the explanation without immediate suspicion. But by my second week on the job, I began to notice a strange behavioral pattern. Whenever I brought up Ronan to ask about his previous risk assessment frameworks, the conversation would instantly die. People would look at their monitors or suddenly remember a meeting they had to attend. Nobody ever spoke about him for more than 2 sentences. His name was treated like a dangerous liability that needed to be scrubbed from the building entirely. That was merely the first crack in the facade. The deeper I dug into the daily operations, the more warped the internal reality became. I started spending time on the engineering floor, away from the executive suites. I quickly realized that the lead developers and network architects were far more terrified of the internal legal department than they were of catastrophic system crashes. When I asked the field team managers direct questions about server latency or dropped dispatch signals in rural zones, they would instinctively look over their shoulders before answering. They refused to put anything negative in writing. Instead of logging critical vulnerabilities in the official tracking software, they spoke in coded hypotheticals. A dropped ambulance call was not a failure. It was an unoptimized routing anomaly. A crashed database was merely an unscheduled hibernation event. It took me less than 30 days to map the true anatomy of the company. Crown Edge did not operate on a culture of transparency or public duty. It operated on a culture of silence, and that silence was heavily compensated. I realized that if you found a critical bug in the dispatch code, you were implicitly encouraged to ignore it. Push the software update through to the client, and wait for your quarterly retention bonus to hit your bank account. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. On the outside, Crown Edge was pouring millions of dollars into public relations campaigns, branding themselves as the unbreakable digital backbone for modern, forward-thinking cities. But on the inside, walking the halls and reading between the lines of the heavily redacted technical reports, It felt exactly like a dying company that was just trying to keep the water out of the engine room long enough to finalize a massive corporate buyout. Everything they did was a holding pattern. They were not building a sustainable product. They were dressing up a corpse for an open casket funeral, hoping the buyers at Aldervale Capital would not check the pulse before signing the check. Any sane professional would have recognized the toxicity, packed up their desk, and walked out the door before their own reputation got dragged into the mud. A more cynical person might have simply kept their mouth shut, waited 6 months for their stock options to vest, and let the impending disaster become the acquiring firm's problem. But I did not submit my resignation. I stayed. I did not stay because I harbored some blind ambition to climb the corporate ladder. Nor did I stay out of a naive hope that I could single-handedly reform a corrupt executive board. I stayed because of a very specific, deeply ingrained professional intuition that had never steered me wrong in 15 years. The level of paranoia I witnessed on the engineering floor, combined with the absolute erasure of Ronan Bell, painted a very clear picture. If a corporation of this magnitude, handling contracts that dictated whether people lived or died in emergencies, was working this aggressively to hide something, the underlying problem was not a minor coding error. It was massive. And more importantly, it was not a new development born out of rapid expansion. It was a foundational rot that had been there for years. I realized they had not hired me to fix their systems. They had hired my pristine reputation. They wanted my signature on the final compliance audit to serve as a shield of legitimacy for their fraudulent data. They thought I would be dazzled by the salary and intimidated by the executive titles. They were wrong. I was not intimidated, and I was no longer interested in quietly fixing their dirty processes. As I sat in my office late one evening, watching the city lights of Denver flicker outside my window, my mindset completely shifted. I was no longer a system auditor trying to keep a company on the right path. I was a hunter who had just found a fresh trail of blood in the snow, and I was going to follow it all the way to the top. The real work began long after the sun went down and the corporate headquarters finally emptied out. I sat in the cold, blue glow of my dual monitors, deliberately cross-referencing the finalized sales reports against the raw, unfiltered server logs I had quietly extracted from the back-end architecture. The glossy marketing brochures we handed out to county commissioners and city mayors proudly guaranteed an emergency response uptime of 99.98%. It was a beautiful, deeply reassuring statistic. But the raw packet data flowing across my screen told a starkly different story. I traced the connection drops across 3 major municipalities currently running our software. There were system blackout windows lasting over 2 hours during peak weekend shifts. Massive data gaps that had been completely scrubbed from the client-facing performance reports. It was not just the digital software that was rotting from the inside. The physical hardware infrastructure was a ticking time bomb. I pulled up the maintenance manifests for our field signal relays. These were the remote, weather-beaten towers that bounced dispatch calls across sprawling rural counties. Each relay relied on heavy-duty backup batteries to keep the network alive in the event of a local grid failure. The central database showed hundreds of these specific units marked as newly replaced over the last 6 months. But when I bypassed the central system and cross-checked the individual serial numbers against the original manufacturer warranties, the truth hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The batteries were expired. They had been dead for over 3 years. We were actively billing municipal governments tens of thousands of dollars for ghost hardware, leaving their emergency communications networks completely exposed to the next major storm or power outage. The internal IT ticketing system was even more brazen in its deception. Critical security vulnerabilities, automatically flagged by routine system scans, were being manually closed within 7 minutes of creation. I cornered one of the senior field engineers by the break room coffee machine and asked him directly about a specific, highly critical closed ticket regarding a firewall breach in District 4. He froze. He looked at me, his eyes darting nervously toward the glass hallway to ensure nobody was listening, and told me flatly that nobody had ever been dispatched to fix it. The management software simply auto-resolved the critical warnings to keep the operational queue looking perfectly clean for the higher-ups. As I dug deeper into the archives over the next few days, a chilling, undeniable pattern emerged. Every 3 months, right before the quarterly earnings calls and major investor check-ins, the error rates plummeted across the board. Server latency magically vanished. Dropped call percentages dropped to absolute zero. It was as if the software had suddenly learned how to lie on a schedule, artificially smoothing out its own failures exactly when the executive board needed to project an aura of perfection to Wall Street and potential buyers. I was not the only person inside the building who saw the cracks, though I was the only one in a position of authority willing to look at them. Late one afternoon, Tessa Wynn, a 24-year-old data engineer who always looked like she was running on pure caffeine and anxiety, walked past my desk. She did not stop to chat. She simply dropped a folded piece of standard printer paper onto my keyboard without making eye contact and kept walking toward the elevators. I unfolded it in the privacy of my locked office. It was a blurry, hastily taken photograph of a computer monitor. It showed an internal metrics dashboard I had never been given access to. It was a shadow system. There were 2 parallel layers of data existing simultaneously within our network, the bleeding. Broken reality monitored in terror by the lower-level engineers, and the sanitized, pristine, entirely fake version projected onto the giant screens in the executive boardrooms. 2 days later, the financial side of the rot revealed itself. Malik Dorsey from the procurement department caught me in the concrete stairwell between the 4th and 5th floors. He leaned against the railing, pretending to scroll through his phone, speaking in a low, rapid whisper. "You need to look at the emergency upgrade disbursements," Malik said, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "We have been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to 3 specific subcontractors over the last 8 months. The technical files attached to the invoices are complete garbage, vague line items for network optimization and urgent routing patches. I tried to look up their corporate registrations last night. They are shell companies. They only exist on paper, and the money is just disappearing into the dark." I had gathered enough raw, unassailable material to trigger a massive federal investigation, let alone halt a corporate buyout. I compiled a preliminary summary of my findings, fully intending to formally request an independent internal audit from the operational leadership team. I expected heavy resistance. I expected to be stonewalled, yelled at, or buried in bureaucratic red tape. Instead, I received an exclusive calendar invite for a private, off-site lunch with Grant Mercer, the chief operating officer. He chose a dimly lit, absurdly expensive steakhouse on the top floor of a downtown high-rise. It was the kind of place where the waiters wore white gloves. The ambient noise was deadened by thick velvet curtains, and the tables were spaced far enough apart to guarantee absolute, unbreakable privacy. Grant was already sitting in a leather booth, sipping a neat bourbon when I arrived. He smiled warmly, radiating that practiced, predatory charm that had likely closed 100 dirty deals before me. For the first 45 minutes, he talked about absolutely everything except the company. He asked about my transition to Denver, my thoughts on the local real estate market, and the mild winter weather we were having. It was a classic, high-level corporate interrogation technique completely disguised as friendly small talk, designed to gauge my stress levels, lower my defenses, and test my overall pliability. Finally, when the porcelain plates were cleared away, he folded his hands on the crisp white linen tablecloth, dropped the casual demeanor, and locked eyes with me. "Ella, you have been doing incredibly thorough work since you joined us," Grant said, his voice dropping to a smooth, confidential register that demanded attention. "Your aggressive attention to detail is exactly what we need as we transition into this new phase with Aldervale Capital. The board is highly impressed with your dedication." "I appreciate that, Grant," I replied carefully, keeping my facial expression entirely neutral. "But my initial review has uncovered several significant, deeply concerning discrepancies between our reported compliance metrics and the actual, functional system architecture." He waved a hand dismissively. brushing away the massive fraud as if I had just pointed out a minor typographical error in an internal memo. "Growing pains," he said smoothly, taking another slow sip of his bourbon. "Every tech company that scales this rapidly has a few skeletons in the closet. That is simply the nature of the beast in this industry. But right now, we are looking at the big picture. We are less than 2 weeks away from closing a deal that will absolutely secure the financial future of this company for the next 20 years. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and produced a thick, professionally embossed envelope, sliding it slowly across the table until it rested right in front of my water glass. "The board wants to ensure that our key personnel are properly incentivized during this critical transition period," Grant continued, his eyes never leaving mine, tracking my every micro-expression. "Inside that envelope is an executive retention agreement. It includes a signing bonus of $750,000, payable directly to your account exactly 48 hours after the Alder Vale acquisition is finalized. All we need from you is your signature on the final system compliance sign-off by this Friday morning. Just a standard confirmation that the infrastructure is deal-ready." I stared at the heavy white paper resting on the table. The air in the private restaurant suddenly felt incredibly thin. It was a breathtakingly elegant, perfectly executed bribe. He was not asking me to fix the broken servers. He was not asking me to investigate the phantom battery replacements or audit the fake subcontractors. He did not care about the dropped emergency calls or the massive security vulnerabilities. He just needed my name on a piece of paper. He needed my hard-earned professional reputation. He needed my ethical seal of approval to wash their fraudulent data completely clean in the eyes of the buyers. "You want me to certify that the system meets all regulatory standards exactly as it stands right now," I said, making sure my voice betrayed nothing but polite professional curiosity. "I want you to be a team player, Ella," Grant replied, his friendly smile suddenly hardening at the edges into a quiet, undeniable threat. "You are standing at the threshold of a very lucrative, very long career with us. Do not overcomplicate things that absolutely do not need to be complicated." As I walked out of the steakhouse and back into the blinding afternoon sun, the true terrifying scale of the sickness finally crystallized in my mind. This was not a tech startup struggling to keep up with its own rapid success. This was a highly organized, heavily fortified machine designed from the ground up to manufacture an illusion. Every single department, from the engineering floor to procurement to the executive suite, was complicit in using fake data to inflate the valuation of a critically failing product. The upcoming buyout was not a corporate milestone, it was their golden escape hatch. They were going to take their hundreds of millions of dollars and walk away, leaving a crumbling, dangerous infrastructure in the hands of an unsuspecting private equity firm, while ordinary citizens paid the ultimate price the next time a hurricane hit or a forest fire broke out. I slipped the envelope containing the massive retention offer into my leather bag. It was the final, perfect piece of the puzzle I needed. They had just tried to buy my silence for nearly $1 million, permanently confirming exactly how desperate they were to keep the truth buried. The corporate servers were a sprawling, poorly mapped labyrinth of redundant databases and forgotten legacy partitions. I spent my nights navigating this digital graveyard long after the cleaning staff had turned off the main floor lights. My breakthrough did not come from a neatly organized financial ledger. It came from a deeply buried subdirectory labeled for obsolete marketing assets from 4 years ago. The file sizes immediately triggered my suspicion. They were far too heavy to be simple text documents, yet too rigidly structured to be raw video files. They were encrypted containers, hidden in plain sight. It took me 3 grueling nights of running a brute force decryption script I had built back in my independent consulting days. I drank lukewarm coffee and watched lines of code cascade across my secondary monitor until my eyes burned. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, the digital lock shattered. The final container cracked open, and the ghost of my predecessor finally spoke to me from the void. Ronan Bell had not burned out. He had been systematically extinguished. I read through his meticulously maintained personal logs, my stomach twisting into a tighter knot with every paragraph. He had discovered the exact same structural decay I was currently staring at. But his flashpoint had occurred down in Louisiana 14 months prior. A parish emergency dispatch center had gone completely dark during a severe late summer storm. For exactly 17 minutes, 0 emergency calls were routed through the system. 17 minutes is an absolute eternity when someone is bleeding on the pavement or a residential house is engulfed in flames. Crown Edge had immediately deployed a massive public relations response team, flooding the local media with statements blaming the catastrophic outage on unprecedented atmospheric interference and isolated local hardware flooding. But Ronan's hidden memos contained the real horrifying truth: a critical routing patch, designed specifically to prevent the exact failure cascade that took down the parish, had been ready for deployment 3 weeks prior to the storm hitting the coast. The executive team had intentionally embargoed the vital software update. Pushing the patch would have required taking the regional servers offline for a minimum of 6 hours. That scheduled downtime would have automatically triggered a severe financial penalty clause in the municipal contract, which would have severely dented the quarterly revenue report right before the board started aggressively shopping the company to private equity firms. They had actively chosen to protect their quarterly earnings over the fundamental safety of an entire parish. Ronan had gathered all the undeniable proof. He had prepared a comprehensive, deeply damaging binder to present to the board of directors. But he never made it into the executive boardroom. According to his final, frantically typed entry, the internal legal team had ambushed him in the underground parking garage as he was walking to his car. They did not just fire him, they financially and professionally crushed him. They presented him with a fabricated, highly detailed dossier accusing him of corporate espionage and gross negligence. They threatened to bury him in retaliatory civil litigation that would completely bankrupt his family and ensure he never worked in the tech industry again. Under immense duress, they forced him to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a voluntary resignation letter. But Ronan was thorough, and he was angry. In the very last encrypted text file, buried at the bottom of a folder containing hundreds of system logs, he left a single, obscure reference. He did not name a sympathetic journalist or a federal industry regulator. He named a specific financial entity, Greyhaven Trust. I spent the next morning discreetly researching the name on a secure, untraceable virtual machine. Greyhaven Trust was the massive financial fiduciary overseeing the performance surety bonds for Crown Edge's largest public utility contracts. If Crown Edge failed to deliver on their municipal guarantees, Greyhaven was the entity legally on the hook for the astronomical financial fallout. They were the invisible shield protecting the taxpayer money. I tracked down the lead compliance adjudicator for our specific corporate portfolio. Her name was Naomi Voss. I did not use my company's cell phone or my secure office line. I bought a cheap burner phone with physical cash from a fluorescent-lit convenience store 3 blocks away from the office tower. I called her direct number during my lunch break, standing in the middle of a noisy, crowded public park to mask the audio of the conversation. Naomi Voss did not mince words, nor did she engage in polite corporate pleasantries. When I introduced myself and mentioned the name Ronan Bell, the line went completely dead silent for 5 agonizing seconds. Then, she asked me exactly what I had found. I laid the entire rotting structure out for her. I detailed the fake uptime numbers, the intentionally delayed security patches, the expired battery units being billed as brand new, and the massive, systemic cover-up orchestrated by the executive board. I do not care about their moral failings, Ella, Naomi said, her voice sounding like thick ice cracking over a frozen winter lake. Greyhaven is a financial institution, not a church. I cannot halt a massive corporate acquisition based on technical discrepancies, internal politics, or your personal ethical outrage. The legal team at Crown Edge would tie us up in federal litigation for 10 years before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. Then what do you need? I asked, gripping the cheap plastic phone tightly against my ear. I need absolute procedural perfection, Naomi replied instantly, her tone shifting into something terrifyingly sharp and calculating. Alder Vale Capital is buying this company based on a sworn, legally binding certification that no undisclosed material risks exist within the product infrastructure. If you can give me absolute, irrefutable proof that the executive board was formally presented with a critical risk warning, and that they intentionally and maliciously refused to receive that warning before signing the final sale documents, then I have the contractual legal authority to immediately freeze the surety bonds. If the bonds freeze, the Aldervale deal dies on the spot. I stood frozen in the park as the cold afternoon wind whipped around me, rustling the dry leaves on the pavement. They already know about the risks, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I am absolutely sure they know everything. Knowing is not enough, Naomi countered smoothly, her logic flawless and completely unyielding. You have to prove they actively, physically avoided the warning. A paper trail can be strategically shredded. A damning email can be quietly deleted from the server or conveniently blamed on a faulty spam filter. You need a physical, undeniable refusal that is permanently recorded. Can you get that for me? Yes, I said, a cold, crystalline realization settling deep into my bones. I can get that. I hung up the phone, snapped the plastic device in half, and dropped it into a heavy iron public trash can. Walking back to the gleaming glass and steel tower of the Crown Edge headquarters, the entire paradigm of my mission fundamentally shifted, up until that specific phone call. I had been operating under the naive assumption that I needed to force the executive team to look at the ugly truth and fix the broken software. I had been trying to do my job. I had been trying to be the moral compass they claimed they wanted when they hired me. But Naomi Voss had just handed me a completely different kind of weapon. The rules of engagement had entirely changed. I realized I no longer needed them to listen to me. In fact, them listening to me and attempting to negotiate a quiet fix was the absolute worst possible outcome for my new objective. I needed them to put their hands over their ears. I needed them to arrogantly slam the door directly in my face. I needed to construct a scenario so perfectly calibrated to their own overwhelming hubris that they would instinctively reject the truth in the most documented, undeniable way possible. I was no longer an auditor diligently trying to save a failing public infrastructure. I was an architect meticulously building a lethal corporate trap. Every single piece of data I gathered, every slide I prepared, and every word I chose from that moment forward was designed for one singular, devastating purpose. I was going to march 12 incredibly wealthy, legally untouchable executives into a room, hand them the rope, and watch them confidently pull the lever on their own gallows. Naomi and I spent the entire weekend building a precise legal trap. We did not meet in person at a coffee shop or a park. We communicated exclusively through secure, heavily encrypted messaging protocols that left absolutely no footprint on any corporate server. The operational plan we formulated for Monday morning was an exercise in extreme, calculated restraint. I was not going to walk into that executive boardroom and lay out all of my evidence at once. If I showed them the final, most devastating pieces of the puzzle right away, specifically the digital access logs directly linking their personal electronic signatures to the falsified compliance certificates, they would immediately go into crisis mode. They would claim their accounts were compromised by a rogue engineer or blame a mysterious administrative error. I had to hold those documents back. They were the decisive piece of evidence, and you do not deploy your best weapon when the target still has room to maneuver and fabricate a defense. I needed to present just enough undeniable operational failure to force an arrogant reaction, but not enough to trigger an immediate legal lockdown before they incriminated themselves on camera. On Monday morning, exactly 2 hours before the presentation was scheduled to begin, Lila Boone from the administrative suite caught me in the women's restroom. She looked terrified, her hands visibly shaking as she pretended to fix her makeup in the mirror, leaning close. She whispered that the legal department had been working late on Sunday night. They had already drafted my termination papers. The executive team was not walking into that boardroom to review my auditing findings or discuss system architecture. They were walking in to execute a premeditated corporate assassination. They planned to let me speak just long enough to brand me as a disgruntled, highly unstable employee, and then fire me for cause to discredit the data. Hearing that warning did not make my heart race with panic. It made me smile a cold, hard smile. It meant their arrogance was perfectly aligned with the trap I had built. I walked straight from the restroom to my private office and pulled up the internal security policy guidelines for the executive floor. The boardroom was equipped with a high-definition, voice-activated camera and microphone system, originally installed to record mandatory shareholder meetings and compliance briefings. Standard operating procedure dictated that these audiovisual recordings were stored on a local, secure server controlled entirely by our internal IT department. That meant the board could simply order the system administrator to wipe the footage the second I was escorted out of the room. I spent the next 45 minutes writing a highly specialized custom routing script. I bypassed the local server architecture entirely and set up a ghost protocol. I programmed the system so that the moment the camera's recording light turned red, the audio and video feed would automatically duplicate and stream directly to a secure, external data vault maintained by North Harbor Assurance, completely outside the jurisdiction of Crown Edge. By the time our IT team figured out the data was being siphoned off-site, the footage of their reaction would be permanently locked away. When I finally stood at the podium in the boardroom, facing all 12 executives, every single word I spoke was meticulously selected from a sterilized, legally binding vocabulary. I completely stripped my voice of any passion or moral outrage. I did not make emotional accusations of fraud. I did not talk about public safety or the lives that could be lost when the dispatch system failed. I strictly utilized phrases that would corner them procedurally. I spoke of raw data, physical discrepancies, and reporting mismatches. I laid out the unscrubbed server logs right next to their sanitized investor dashboards, calmly forcing them to look at the massive, undeniable void between reality and their fabricated numbers. I needed them to react badly, and because they firmly believed they already held my termination papers in their pockets, they played their parts with absolute, flawless arrogance. When Grant Mercer stood up, it was not just a silent, theatrical exit. The high-definition microphones embedded in the ceiling captured the exact vocalization of his contempt. "We do not have time for one person derailing a multi-million-dollar transaction over a personal obsession with statistical anomalies," Grant said, his voice loud, clear, and perfectly recorded. He was not alone. As the rest of the board gathered their leather folios and moved toward the exit, Daniel K. chimed in, perfectly augmenting the recording with another layer of willful ignorance. "You clearly do not understand the level of this room or the stakes of this deal." Daniel sneered, not even bothering to look back at the screen showing the failing emergency grid. They walked out, thoroughly convinced they had just orchestrated a brilliant display of dominant corporate theater, permanently silencing a rogue auditor. They did not realize that their verbal dismissal of the physical discrepancies, combined with their coordinated exit from a compliance briefing, was the exact textbook definition of intentionally refusing a critical risk warning. Less than 10 minutes after the boardroom emptied, and I made my brief, cryptic phone call to Naomi Voss. The heavy frosted glass door of my private office swung open. Maris Vale, the general counsel for Crown Edge, marched in. She was accompanied by two massive, stone-faced security guards who immediately positioned themselves on either side of the doorway, physically blocking my exit. Maris did not look angry. She looked completely bored, like a woman performing a routine, tedious pest extermination. "Ella Perez, your employment at Crown Edge Response Solutions is terminated, effective immediately, due to gross insubordination, extreme unprofessionalism, and breach of corporate conduct," Maris recited in a flat, mechanical tone, handing me a thick, sealed manila envelope. "You are required to surrender your laptop, your corporate smartphone, your physical notebook, your access badge, and absolutely all work product you have generated during your tenure here. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal belongings before security escorts you off the premises." She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she pointed a manicured finger at my desk. "Do not try to copy anything. IT has already locked you out of the internal network." I looked at Maris, allowing a perfect mask of defeated, terrified compliance to slide over my face. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, demand an explanation, or threaten to call a labor attorney. I simply nodded slowly, acting exactly like the crushed, humiliated whistleblower they expected me to be. I reached slowly into my bottom desk drawer and pulled out a heavy, black leather binder. I placed it gently on the center of my desk. Inside were hundreds of printed pages of system error reports, outdated battery manifests, and internal ticketing logs. It looked exactly like a comprehensive, highly damaging whistleblowing dossier. It was entirely real data, but it was also completely useless in a court of law without the executive signatures tying them directly to the fraud. It was a perfectly constructed, highly visible decoy. I handed over my company laptop, my phone, and my access badge. Maris snatched the black binder with a look of immense, smug satisfaction, thinking she had just confiscated the entirety of my leverage. She fully believed she was seizing the bomb before it could detonate. She had absolutely no idea that the real chain of evidence, the encrypted files proving their premeditated intent, the shadow dashboard photos provided by Tessa Wynn, and the routing script tying their signatures to the fake certificates, had never been on that laptop or in that binder. They had been sitting safely in an isolated, legally protected off-site server since Sunday night. As the security guards marched me through the brightly lit main lobby toward the revolving front doors, I kept my head slightly bowed, letting the administrative staff stare at me in hushed shock. They saw a woman whose career had just been brutally and publicly executed. They saw a total, humiliating defeat. But as the cool Denver air hit my face on the sidewalk outside, a profound, electrifying sense of victory washed over me. The public humiliation they had meticulously staged in the boardroom to break my spirit was not a defeat at all. It was the final, indispensable piece of the puzzle I needed. By orchestrating that walkout and immediately firing me to silence the data, they had legally validated my entire counterattack. They had locked the doors from the inside, handed me the matches, and completely drenched their own empire in gasoline. I sat on a cold concrete bench in the corporate plaza, staring up at the gleaming glass facade of the Crown Edge building. It had been exactly 45 minutes since the security guards had marched me through the revolving doors. My hands were empty, my pockets stripped of my company phone and access badge, but I had never felt more heavily armed. Right on schedule. 3 black luxury vehicles abruptly pulled up to the curbside drop-off zone, tires chirping against the pavement. The doors swung open in unison. Naomi Voss stepped out first. She wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and carried a sleek titanium briefcase. Behind her emerged a team of 6 forensic auditors from Greyhaven Trust, all moving with the synchronized, terrifying purpose of a corporate SWAT team. Naomi locked eyes with me across the plaza. She gave a single, curt nod. I stood up from the bench and fell into step beside her as her team marched directly toward the main entrance. The 2 massive security guards who had just gleefully evicted me were still stationed by the glass turnstiles. When they saw me walking back through the revolving doors, they immediately stepped forward, raising their hands to physically block my path. "Ma'am, you have been permanently trespassed from this property." The taller guard barked, reaching for his radio. Naomi did not even break her stride. She reached into her blazer, pulled out a heavily stamped legal injunction, and pressed it flat against the chest of the security guard. "I am Naomi Voss, Senior Compliance Adjudicator for Greyhaven Trust," she stated, her voice echoing off the high marble floors of the lobby. "This is a federally backed notice of evidence preservation and an immediate, binding suspension of the Alder Vale capital acquisition. If you touch her, or if you impede my team from accessing the executive elevators for even 1 second, you will be personally named in an obstruction of justice lawsuit before you finish your shift." The guard swallowed hard, his hands dropping to his sides. He stepped back. The turnstiles beeped green as Naomi's team swiped their high-level vendor access cards, bypassing the standard visitor protocols entirely. We did not even have to ride the elevator up to the executive suite. Word of the Greyhaven strike team had already flashed across the internal communications network. The polished stainless steel doors of the private executive elevator dinged open on the ground floor, and Grant Mercer stormed out, followed closely by Maris Vale and a frantic-looking Daniel Kay. The polished, predatory charm Grant had weaponized against me at the steakhouse was completely gone. His face was flushed, and his jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. "What the hell is the meaning of this, Voss?" Grant demanded, his voice echoing in the cavernous lobby. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "She does not belong here. She was terminated for gross misconduct less than an hour ago." Naomi stopped perfectly still in the center of the lobby. Surrounded by her auditors, employees from the lower floors were beginning to gather on the glass-railed mezzanine above us, drawn by the shouting. "Her employment status is completely irrelevant to me, Grant," Naomi replied, her tone as cold and unyielding as a steel blade. "What is relevant is the fact that less than 2 hours ago, the entire executive board was formally invited to receive a documented presentation regarding critical operational risks within your municipal dispatch infrastructure. Instead of receiving that warning, all 12 of you actively, intentionally, and on camera refused to acknowledge it. That was an internal disciplinary matter regarding a disgruntled employee," Maris Vale interjected smoothly, stepping in front of Grant to run damage control. "It has absolutely no bearing on the pending transaction." "It has every bearing on the transaction," Naomi fired back, taking a single step closer to the general counsel. "Because tomorrow morning, you are all scheduled to sign a legally binding declaration for Aldervale Capital, explicitly stating that no undisclosed material risks exist within this company. Actively refusing to look at a risk so you can claim ignorance tomorrow is not a defense. Maris, it is the textbook legal definition of premeditated fraud." Daniel Kay, the chief financial officer, suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. The color completely drained from his face. "Aldervale Capital was notified 20 minutes ago," Naomi continued, driving the blade deeper. "They have officially frozen the hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in the escrow account. The deal is dead in the water. They are demanding a full, independent forensic audit of your entire technical infrastructure before they will even return your phone calls." Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally shattered the pristine executive facade. Maris Vale immediately pulled out her smartphone, her thumbs flying across the screen as she began frantically texting the director of the IT department, undoubtedly ordering a total server lockdown and a catastrophic deletion of all internal ticketing logs. Naomi watched her do it and smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Do not bother texting your IT department to scrub the servers, Maris," Naomi said softly, though the silence in the lobby made her words carry all the way to the mezzanine. "Per the updated surety bond conditions from last year, your system compliance data and internal routing logs have been continuously and automatically mirrored to an independent, secure data vault operated by North Harbor Assurance. You cannot delete the evidence. You cannot lock us out. We already have everything." The absolute terror that washed over the three executives was a physical thing. They had spent years building a culture where they controlled the narrative, where they could simply fire anyone who spoke up and erase the data that proved them wrong. In a matter of seconds, Naomi had stripped them of their only weapons. They were entirely exposed. The dynamic of the room shifted violently. The employees watching from above, the people who had spent months terrified of their own shadows, suddenly saw their invincible leaders completely paralyzed in the middle of their own lobby. The executives who had ruled the morning were suddenly scrambling, making panicked phone calls to outside legal counsel, their hands shaking as they pressed their phones to their ears. Grant Mercer turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated hatred. He stepped into my personal space, lowering his voice to a venomous hiss. "You have absolutely no idea what you have just done," Grant threatened, his breath smelling faintly of peppermint and stale coffee. "You just buried your entire career. Nobody in this industry will ever hire you again." I did not back away. I stood my ground, staring directly into his panicked eyes. Before I could even open my mouth to respond, Naomi stepped seamlessly between us. "No, Grant," Naomi said, her voice dripping with absolute legal authority. "She did not bury her career. She just stopped you from committing felony fraud." I looked up at the mezzanine. Tessa Wynne, the young data engineer who had secretly passed me the shadow dashboard photo, was standing by the glass railing. Next to her was Malik Dorsey from procurement. For the first time since I had arrived at Crown Edge, they were not looking over their shoulders. They were standing tall, watching the impenetrable wall of corporate silence shatter into a million pieces. They finally realized there was an outside force strong enough to stop the board from silencing the truth. It was the most deeply satisfying moment of my professional life. I had not needed to light a match or detonate a bomb to destroy their corrupt empire. I simply picked up a phone and stopped the money from flowing. And in the sterilized, high-stakes world of corporate acquisitions, the sudden, deafening silence of frozen capital was the most spectacular explosion of all. The air inside the main conference room at 8 o'clock the next morning tasted completely different than it had the day before. Yesterday, the atmosphere had been thick with corporate arrogance and manufactured superiority. Today, it felt like the inside of a pressurized cabin seconds before the windows blow out. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. I was no longer the rogue employee fighting for my professional life. I was the chief witness for the prosecution. Gathered around the table were the 7 independent members of the board of directors. A senior partner from a notoriously aggressive external corporate defense firm, and a sharply dressed managing director representing the Aldervale Capital Buyout Fund. Grant Mercer and Daniel Kay were also present, permitted to attend only because their official suspensions had not yet been processed by Human Resources. They looked hollowed out, their pristine executive armor thoroughly fractured after 24 hours of sheer panic. I did not use a digital projector this time. I did not want them staring at a screen where they could easily detach themselves from the information. Instead, I placed identical, heavily bound physical dossiers in front of every single person at the table. I wanted them to feel the sheer weight of the fraud in their hands. "Please open your binders to page 1, I instructed, my voice flat and entirely devoid of emotion. For the next 45 minutes, I surgically dismantled the company they thought they governed. I walked them through the undeniable sequence of the technical collapse. I pointed to the raw server logs proving the system blackouts. I directed their attention to the invoices for the emergency upgrades that were completely fabricated, and the security tickets that were fraudulently closed by automated management software. I spoke slowly, letting every single piece of evidence land like a heavy blade chopping through bone. The board members flipped the heavy paper pages, the only sound in the room being the frantic scratching of the external legal counsel taking notes on a yellow legal pad. Ms. Perez, one of the board members, an older man with silver hair and a heavy gold watch, interrupted. His voice carried a desperate, clinging tone. "We acknowledge that these technical discrepancies are severe. However, rapid scaling in the technology sector frequently leads to operational oversights and mismanaged field reports. Making the leap from gross incompetence to intentional, systemic fraud is a massive accusation." I looked directly at him, holding his gaze until he shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. "Please turn to page 12, I said softly. The sound of rustling paper filled the room. I watched their eyes scan the printed lines of code I had highlighted in bright yellow ink. "An operational oversight is forgetting to renew a vendor license," I explained, leaning forward slightly. "What you are looking at on page 12 is a custom-coded data filter. This script was specifically designed and embedded into the network architecture to automatically intercept any municipal dispatch blackout lasting longer than 4 minutes, entirely scrub it from the data pool, and generate a false positive status on the investor-facing dashboard. This code was accessible only via the executive administrative tier. The beautiful metrics you have been presenting to Aldervale Capital were not the result of incompetence. They were aggressively manufactured by a machine designed to lie to you." The silver-haired board member opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply stared at the lines of code as if they were written in a foreign language. But the deception was not merely designed to protect the corporate valuation. I continued, seamlessly driving the knife deeper. Please turn to page 22. This was the pivot point. This was the moment the narrative shifted from a desperate attempt to secure a corporate buyout into something significantly darker. On page 22, you will see the financial ledgers detailing the emergency response disbursements, I stated, watching Grant Mercer flinch as if he had been physically struck. Over the past 8 months, millions of dollars have been funneled to 3 specific, unvetted subcontractors for urgent network optimization. If you cross-reference those payments with the state business registry records on the following page, you will find the corporate ownership structures for those 3 entities. I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room, making sure every single person was looking at the exact lines I was about to read aloud. The primary shareholder of the first subcontractor is Grant Mercer's biological brother, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like glass. The other 2 entities are wholly owned subsidiary branches of the boutique consulting firm where Daniel K. served as a managing partner immediately prior to being hired as your chief financial officer. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely visceral. A female board member at the center of the table physically recoiled, dropping her pen onto the mahogany wood with a sharp clatter. The external legal counsel stopped writing completely, his pen hovering frozen over his notepad. He slowly looked up, his eyes darting between Grant and Daniel with the terrifying realization that he was no longer defending a company against a breach of contract, but rather defending a criminal syndicate against federal embezzlement charges. Grant Mercer stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, his face entirely drained of blood. He knew any attempt to explain away the familial financial ties would only sound like a pathetic confession. Daniel K. simply closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands, completely surrendering to the reality of his own destruction. This is not just a cover-up to save a corporate acquisition, I told the board, looking at their horrified faces. This is an organized, calculated extraction of corporate funds disguised as emergency maintenance for a failing public utility. Before anyone could formulate a response, I delivered the final blow of the morning session. I instructed them to turn to the very last page of the binder. You might be wondering why the executive team was so quick to terminate my employment yesterday afternoon, I said. On the final page, you will find a human resources dossier. It details my alleged behavioral issues, classifying me as extremely difficult to work with, highly unstable, and prone to manufacturing extreme technical grievances. I watched the board members read the damning paragraphs. Look at the date stamped at the top right corner of that document, I instructed. The female board member traced the date with her index finger, her eyes widening in absolute shock. This termination dossier was drafted and legally reviewed almost 3 weeks ago, I explained, long before I ever requested a formal compliance review. They knew exactly what I was going to find. And they spent nearly a month quietly building a fabricated narrative to completely destroy my professional credibility the moment I tried to present the truth to this board. The realization hit the independent board members like a physical weight. The remaining layers of denial completely evaporated. They finally understood that they were not dealing with a disgruntled, emotional employee making wild accusations. They were sitting across from a meticulously constructed fortress of lies, built with heavy legal terminology, fake dashboards, and stolen money. Suddenly, the managing director from Aldervale Capital stood up. He did not say a single word. He did not look at Grant, Daniel, or the board members. He simply closed his binder, picked up his briefcase, and walked briskly toward the exit. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket before he even reached the door. Everyone in the room watched him leave. The heavy door clicked shut behind him, sealing the fate of the transaction. The corporate buyout was no longer simply delayed or under investigation. That man walking out of the room to call his fund was the undeniable, physical manifestation of a multi-billion-dollar deal dying right in front of their eyes. The boardroom descended into a thick, suffocating silence. The external lawyer finally lowered his pen, looking at the board members with an expression of profound, grim certainty. The executives at the table looked utterly broken, their eyes hollow, fully believing that they had just heard the absolute worst details of the catastrophe. They thought they had finally hit the bottom of the crater. I sat quietly at the end of the table, folding my hands together. I watched their devastated expressions, knowing full well that the true earthquake, the revelation that would send the entire corporate structure into an unrecoverable freefall, had not even been opened yet. Everett Sloan, the chairman of the board of directors, had built a 40-year career by knowing exactly when to sacrifice a sinking ship to save his own lifeboat, sitting at the head of the heavy mahogany table. Everett adjusted his silk tie and cleared his throat. He looked at the shattered remnants of the executive team, Grant Mercer and Daniel Kay, with an expression of profound, manufactured disappointment. He was trying to pivot. He was trying to construct a firewall between the rogue executives and the supposedly innocent oversight of the board. "This is an absolute tragedy of corporate governance," Everett began, his voice dropping into a solemn, commanding register designed to project unimpeachable integrity. He looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the remaining independent board members. "If what you have presented is true, Miss Perez, then this board has been the victim of an elaborate, highly sophisticated deception. I will personally motion to initiate a full, independent external investigation by a federal auditing firm. We will root out this bad behavior, terminate anyone involved, and cooperate fully with the authorities." He folded his hands, looking at me with the benevolent patience of a man who believed he had just successfully navigated his way out of a minefield. He was offering up the chief operating officer and the chief financial officer as blood sacrifices, hoping the sheer scale of their embezzlement would blind everyone to his own complicity. I did not raise my voice. I did not indulge in the emotional satisfaction of calling him a liar to his face. I simply reached out and tapped the thick leather binder resting on the table in front of him. "There is no need to hire an external firm to find the root of the problem. Everett," I said quietly, "you just need to turn to page 23. Everett's benevolent mask slipped slightly. He hesitated, his eyes darting toward his external legal counsel, before slowly flipping the heavy paper pages. The other board members followed suit, the rustling of paper sounding exceptionally loud in the tense silence of the room. "What you are looking at is a series of internal board addendums from exactly 8 months ago," I explained, watching Everett's face as his eyes scanned the text he had personally signed. "When Aldervale Capital first initiated their due diligence process, our automated compliance scanners flagged 37 separate critical failures within the municipal dispatch infrastructure. Those failures legally prevented this company from moving forward with any asset sale." "I am not a software engineer, Miss Perez," Everett interrupted defensively, his voice losing its polished resonance. "I rely on the technical summaries provided to me by the executive suite. If they omitted the severity of those flags, that is their failure, not the failure of this board." "They did not omit anything," I countered smoothly, pointing at the specific paragraph highlighted on the page. "You did not write an explicit email ordering anyone to cover up the system failures. Everett, you are far too experienced for that. Instead, you drafted and officially approved what you classified as transitional language. You signed a board directive instructing the compliance department to reclassify those 37 critical failures as acceptable forward-looking operational tolerances. You legally redefined a broken, dangerous system as a functioning one, specifically to allow the Aldervale acquisition to proceed despite the open compliance exceptions." The external lawyer sitting next to Everett suddenly leaned away from the chairman, creating a very distinct physical distance between them. Everett had not left a smoking gun. He had left a meticulously documented paper trail of willful ignorance. He knew the system was failing. He knew the risks were monumental, and he used his executive authority to deliberately bury those risks under a mountain of impenetrable legal jargon just to push the multi-million-dollar buyout across the finish line. That language was drafted under the assumption that the engineering team was actively patching the anomalies. Everett stammered, his pristine composure completely disintegrating. It was standard administrative maneuvering to prevent the deal from stalling over minor technicalities. Before Everett could spin another layer of plausible deniability, the heavy boardroom doors swung open. Naomi Voss walked into the room. She did not ask for permission to enter. She moved with the absolute, terrifying authority of a woman who held the financial lifeblood of the entire company in her briefcase. She walked directly to the head of the table and stood right next to Everett Sloan. "It was not a minor technicality, Everett," Naomi stated, her voice icy and uncompromising. "And your administrative maneuvering has just triggered a catastrophic default on your municipal surety bonds." Everett looked up at her. His face flushed with a mixture of anger and rising panic. "Greyhaven Trust has the authority to freeze the escrow. Voss, I acknowledge that. But you do not have the authority to barge into a closed meeting of the board of directors. I am still the chairman of this company." Naomi looked down at him with an expression of sheer pity. She unclasped her titanium briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of heavy legal parchment. "You really should have read the full text of the performance bonds you signed 3 years ago," Naomi said, sliding the document across the polished wood until it rested directly over his binder. "There is a specific fiduciary covenant embedded deep in the secondary clauses. If it is discovered that the corporate entity has engaged in systemic, documented fraud that directly threatens the operational integrity of the bonded public utility contracts, Greyhaven Trust does not just freeze the capital. We are legally granted temporary, unilateral receivership over all asset sales and corporate restructuring until the municipal risks are neutralized." The silence that followed her words was absolute. The implication hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "What does that mean?" one of the independent board members asked, his voice trembling slightly. "It means," Naomi answered, never taking her eyes off Everett, "that as of this exact second, Everett Sloan has absolutely no authority to approve a sale, authorize an investigation, or even order a cup of coffee on the company account without my explicit, written permission. You have lost the moral high ground, Everett, and now you have lost the company." Everett sank back into his heavy leather chair, the color completely draining from his face. The illusion of his untouchable elite status was gone. He was no longer the brilliant statesman managing a crisis. He was just another desperate man caught in a lie. But the destruction of their corporate hierarchy was not the end. I had one final devastating piece of reality to introduce to the room. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out a manila envelope. "While Greyhaven Trust secures the financial perimeter," I said, drawing the attention of the entire room back to me, "we need to address the legal perimeter, specifically, your personal legal perimeters." I opened the envelope and extracted a notarized, 7-page document. It was not a technical log or a financial spreadsheet. It was a sworn, legally binding affidavit. 14 months ago, my predecessor, Ronan Bell, discovered the exact same rotting infrastructure that I presented to you today. I told the room, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet space. The executive team claimed he resigned due to severe professional burnout. That was a lie. I held up the affidavit, making sure the external legal counsel could clearly see the official notary stamp pressed into the bottom corner of the paper. "This is a sworn statement from Ronan Bell, secured and legally verified last night," I continued. In it, he details exactly how he was forced out of this company. He did not just warn the chief operating officer. He did not just warn the general counsel. According to this sworn testimony, Ronan Bell presented a comprehensive risk assessment directly to this entire board of directors during a closed executive session. He explicitly warned every single one of you that people could die if the emergency dispatch routing was not immediately taken offline and repaired. The female board member who had dropped her pen earlier let out a soft, horrified gasp. She pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. The affidavit goes on to detail how, less than 48 hours after giving that warning, Ronan was ambushed in the parking garage by your legal department. I read from the document, my voice cold and relentless. He was presented with a fabricated dossier accusing him of corporate espionage. He was explicitly told that if he did not sign a non-disclosure agreement and a voluntary resignation letter, this board would personally fund a campaign of retaliatory civil litigation designed to entirely bankrupt his family. You gave him a choice between absolute silence or total financial annihilation. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted completely. It was no longer a conversation about lost bonuses, frozen escrow accounts, or failed corporate acquisitions. The temperature in the room plummeted as the terrifying, undeniable specter of criminal liability suddenly materialized behind every single chair. Willful ignorance of a failing product was a civil nightmare, but actively conspiring to blackmail and extort a whistleblower to cover up a public safety hazard that crossed state lines was a massive federal crime. It meant pierced corporate veils. It meant the directors' and officers' liability insurance policies would immediately void themselves. It meant the people sitting at this table were suddenly looking at the very real possibility of federal prison sentences and the total liquidation of their personal assets. I looked down the length of the table. Grant Mercer was staring blankly at the wall. Daniel Kay was quietly hyperventilating into his hands. Everett Sloan looked like he had aged 20 years in the span of 10 minutes. They had spent their entire careers believing that the rules did not apply to them as long as they stayed on the highest floor of the building and never looked too closely at the dirt below. They had built an entire ecosystem of polished lies, surviving by aggressively punishing anyone who dared to speak the truth. As I stood there, watching their empire of arrogance finally collapse under the crushing weight of its own corruption, the ultimate realization settled over the room. I had not just defeated a handful of greedy executives, I had systematically dismantled the entire untouchable upper echelon of the company, using their own signatures, their own policies, and their own blinding hubris to lock them inside a cage of their own making. The beast was wounded, but a wounded corporate beast is the most dangerous kind of animal. By noon, my newly purchased burner phone began vibrating continuously with alerts. The executive board had officially activated their crisis public relations firm. Industry tech blogs and financial news websites simultaneously published exclusive insider reports. The narrative they spun was expertly crafted and devastatingly fast. I was suddenly painted not as a whistleblower protecting public safety, but as a deeply confused, emotionally volatile mid-level director who had fundamentally misinterpreted complex data architecture solely because I was bitter about being denied a promotion to vice president. Simultaneously, dozens of anonymous accounts on professional networking platforms began flooding the comment sections of these articles. They utilized very specific, highly targeted vocabulary. They called me highly unstable, difficult to collaborate with, and prone to manufacturing extreme technical grievances. It was a coordinated, vicious character assassination designed specifically to make the investors at Aldervale Capital believe the problem was my sanity, not the software. But they were playing a desperate game I had already mapped out. I immediately opened a secure encrypted channel with Naomi Voss and the lead investigators at the buyout fund. I sent them the raw cryptographic metadata and the unalterable timestamp logs from the human resources dossier we had exposed that morning. The data unequivocally proved that the very phrases currently circulating in the industry press had been drafted, legally reviewed, and approved by the Corporate Communications Department exactly 21 days before I ever requested the final compliance review. The smear campaign was a premeditated script pulled from a drawer, not a genuine reaction to a rogue employee. Seeing the PR counterattack fail in real time gave the rest of the building the courage they desperately needed. Tessa Wynn, the young data engineer, bypassed her direct supervisors entirely and marched straight into the temporary command center Naomi had established on the third floor. Tessa slammed a thick stack of printed internal messaging logs onto the conference table. The exports clearly showed the vice president of engineering explicitly ordering the data analytics team to soften the downtime metrics and manually smooth out the blackout valleys across the database exactly 48 hours before every major investor roadshow in New York. The engineers had pushed back in the chats, citing regulatory violations, only to be threatened with immediate termination if they did not comply. Less than an hour later, Malik Dorsey from the procurement division delivered the final nail for the financial defense. He handed over the raw banking verification codes and the international wire transfer receipts that perfectly matched the timeline of the fake emergency technical upgrades. The documents tracked millions of dollars flowing directly out of the municipal infrastructure budget and into the offshore accounts of the shell companies owned by Grant Mercer's brother and Daniel Kaye's former consulting partners. It completely obliterated the boardroom narrative that these issues were merely the operational growing pains of a rapidly expanding tech firm. It was undeniable, highly organized, corporate theft. Once the middle managers saw Tessa and Malik walk into that command center and walk out holding signed federal whistleblower protection agreements, the dam completely broke. Directors of regional sales, lead network architects, and senior compliance officers began quietly lining up outside the frosted glass door. They all wanted immunity from prosecution. Within 4 hours, the volume of sworn evidence against the executive board multiplied by a factor of 10. I thought we had entirely crushed them. I thought the sheer, suffocating weight of the federal crimes would force an immediate, unconditional surrender from the top floor. But I had severely underestimated the sociopathic survival instinct of Everett Sloan. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the secure phone resting on the table in front of Naomi rang loudly. She answered it, listened in absolute silence for a full minute, and her expression hardened into a mask of pure, professional disbelief. She ended the call and looked across the table at me. Her jaw clenched. "Sloan is still moving," Naomi said, her voice tight with frustration. "He just got off a private conference call with the senior managing partners at Aldervale Capital. He is aggressively pushing for an adjusted emergency signing session at exactly 5 o'clock today." I stared at her, genuinely shocked by the audacity. How is that even mathematically or legally possible? The entire operational foundation of the product is a proven fraud. They cannot sell a broken emergency system. "He is attempting a corporate amputation," Naomi explained, pacing the length of the room. "Everett is offering to personally fire Grant Mercer, Daniel Kaye, and the entire legal department right this second. He is promising to surrender all of their unvested stock options and hand their internal communications over to federal prosecutors on a silver platter. He is pitching Aldervale the idea that the embezzlement and the data manipulation were strictly contained to a rogue faction of the executive suite. He wants to discount the total purchase price of the company by 20%, retain his position as chairman to oversee the transition period, and push the restructured acquisition through before the financial markets close today." It was a breathtakingly ruthless maneuver. Everett was perfectly willing to throw his closest allies directly into a federal prison cell in order to save his own golden parachute and secure the massive financial payouts for the remaining independent board members. And the most terrifying part was that Aldervale Capital, a fund driven purely by the prospect of acquiring undervalued intellectual property, was actually considering the heavily discounted offer. They saw an opportunity to buy the core routing algorithms of the company for pennies on the dollar, completely insulated from the criminal liability by Everett's sacrificial lambs. "If they sign that adjusted agreement at 5 o'clock, I said slowly, tracing the horrifying implications, "Everett walks away with his reputation and his millions intact. The remaining board members get their lucrative exit bonuses. Mercer and Kaye take the fall for absolutely everything, and the systemic danger to the municipal dispatch systems simply gets buried under a quiet, multi-year restructuring plan." "Exactly," Naomi confirmed, stopping her pacing to look at me. "Greyhaven Trust can freeze the performance bonds over the fraud. But if Aldervale formally agrees to legally absorb the liability and indemnify the public utility contracts under a massive new corporate umbrella, my legal authority to halt the asset sale completely evaporates. Everett knows exactly where the legal loopholes are buried. He thinks he has found the fire exit." The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly tight. We had spent days meticulously backing them into a steel corner, yet they still firmly believed they possessed the intelligence, the wealth, and the leverage to negotiate their way out of a burning building. They thought their polished corporate maneuvering could somehow outrun the undeniable truth of the failing servers. I looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was exactly 3:30 in the afternoon. We had exactly 90 minutes before Everett Sloan walked into the executive boardroom to sign a revised contract that would let the absolute worst architects of this disaster slip through the cracks and walk away incredibly wealthy. He needs a majority of the remaining board of directors to sign the revised risk disclosure agreements at 5 o'clock to authorize the sale, I stated, my mind rapidly assembling the final sequence of events. Yes, Naomi said. He is gathering them on the top floor right now. He is convincing them that this is their absolute last chance to avoid total financial ruin and public disgrace. They are desperate enough to believe whatever he says. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted external hard drive. I had held one specific piece of digital evidence back since the very beginning of this operation. It was the singular document I had intentionally excluded from the binders I handed out that morning. I had kept it hidden precisely because I knew men like Everett Sloan would always try to find a scapegoat when the walls started closing in. I knew they would try to compartmentalize the guilt and save themselves. Tell Aldervale Capital to proceed with the 5 o'clock meeting, I told Naomi, plugging the drive into the secure terminal on the desk. Let Everett bring the entire remaining board into that room. Let them prepare the new contracts. And let them think they have successfully thrown Mercer and Kay under the bus. Naomi watched me access the hidden partition on the screen. What exactly do you have? Ella. I have the master lock to their fire exit, I replied, staring at the file name illuminating the monitor. Everett thinks he can legally isolate the blame. He thinks the rest of the board can claim ignorance, sign a clean disclosure today, and walk away with their money. But they cannot. I am going to let them sit down, uncap their incredibly expensive pens, and feel the absolute certainty of their own survival. And then, I am going to drop the final slide. We were heading straight into the climax of the war. They were marching into that 5 o'clock meeting fueled by the arrogant, blinding confidence that they were simply too rich and too powerful to fail. They had absolutely no idea that their desperate sprint toward the only remaining exit was exactly the maneuver I needed them to make. They thought they were walking into a brilliantly negotiated rescue operation, but they were actually walking directly into the center of the trap. And I was holding the final piece of evidence that would weld the doors shut from the outside forever. The clock on the boardroom wall clicked exactly to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The atmosphere in the room was a sickening blend of desperation and manufactured relief. Everett Sloan sat at the head of the table. A freshly printed pile of restructured acquisition contracts resting perfectly centered in front of him. He had spent the last 90 minutes convincing the remaining board members and the managing directors from Aldervale Capital that excising Grant Mercer and Daniel Kay would surgically remove the rot. He was ready to sign away their careers to protect his own golden parachute. If there are no further objections, Everett said, picking up his heavy gold fountain pen, I believe we are ready to execute the transition documents and finalize the adjusted buyout. I have one final comparative document, I stated. My voice was completely flat, slicing through the heavy air of the boardroom. I require exactly 5 minutes of your time before anyone signs anything. Everett paused, the tip of his pen hovering an inch above the signature line. He looked at me with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep irritation. He thought I was just there to witness his administrative victory. Ms. Perez, we have thoroughly reviewed your technical findings, Everett said, trying to sound magnanimous. The offending parties are being removed. There is nothing left to expose. I am not exposing the software this time. Everett, I replied, standing up and plugging my encrypted drive directly into the primary presentation terminal. I am exposing the timeline. The massive wall monitor blinked to life. I did not show them failing server nodes or fraudulent banking wires. I opened the single presentation slide I had intentionally kept hidden since the very beginning. The screen displayed a high-resolution capture of the Aldervale Capital Risk Disclosure Ledger. It was the specific legal document guaranteeing that no undisclosed material risks existed within the Crown Edge system architecture. Look at the electronic signatures, I instructed the room. Every eye in the room locked onto the screen. There were 12 distinct digital signatures, representing the entire executive team, including Everett Sloan. Now look at the server timestamps next to those signatures, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence. Every single one of you signed this legally binding federal disclosure at exactly 10 o'clock on Monday morning. I pressed a button on my remote, and a video window opened on the right side of the screen. It was the high-definition security footage I had safely routed to the external server. The video showed me standing at this exact podium, and it showed the 12 of them sitting in their leather chairs. You formally declared under penalty of perjury that you were unaware of any critical system failures, I said, pointing at the timestamps. And then, exactly 3 hours later, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you all walked into this room. I hit play. The video filled the room with the crisp audio of my voice warning them about the intentionally delayed security patches and the failing emergency infrastructure. Then, the video showed Grant Mercer standing up. It showed the rest of the board rising in perfect, arrogant unison. It captured the exact moment they turned their backs and marched out of the room, loudly refusing to listen to the very risks they had just legally sworn did not exist. You did not sign those disclosures in ignorance, I stated, staring directly at Everett, whose face had turned the color of wet ash. You pre-signed them. You legally certified the system was perfectly safe. And then you deliberately orchestrated a synchronized walkout to physically avoid hearing the truth, so you could claim plausible deniability. That is not an operational oversight. That is premeditated, documented, and undeniably malicious fraud. The gold pen slipped from Everett's fingers and clattered loudly onto the mahogany table. Naomi Voss stepped forward, her titanium briefcase resting at her side. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with the cold, absolute finality of an executioner. Pursuant to the default provisions of the financial surety bonds, Naomi announced, Greyhaven Trust is immediately executing a total freeze on all corporate payouts, every single retention bonus, every executive signing reward, and every severance package allocated to this leadership team is permanently frozen as of this exact second. The representative from Aldervale Capital did not even wait for her to finish. He stood up, picked up the stack of revised contracts Everett had been about to sign, and ripped them completely in half. The discounted offer is officially withdrawn, the Aldervale director said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. We are replacing it with a hostile restructuring mandate. Aldervale will only proceed with saving this company from total bankruptcy if the entire executive team, including you, Everett, resigns immediately, surrenders all corporate devices, and agrees to total cooperation with our forensic auditors. You get nothing. You walk away empty-handed, or we let the market watch you burn to the ground tomorrow morning. Before anyone could even begin to process the magnitude of the financial collapse, the heavy boardroom doors swung open for the last time. 4 men and 2 women wearing dark, unassuming suits walked in. They were not corporate lawyers. They were investigators from the Interstate Procurement Crimes Unit, accompanied by the lead civil investigator from North Harbor Assurance. Nobody is leaving this room, the lead federal investigator stated, dropping a thick stack of legal subpoenas onto the table. We are securing all personal communication devices, freezing targeted personal banking assets, and officially opening a criminal liability investigation into the defrauding of municipal utility infrastructure. Grant Mercer, the man who had confidently led the walkout just days prior, completely lost his mind. His pristine, untouchable facade shattered into a million pathetic pieces. He backed away from the table, his hands raised frantically. "This was Daniel!" Grant shouted, his voice cracking with sheer panic, pointing a shaking finger at the CFO. "He managed the disclosures. The legal department told us we had cover. This is just the growth culture of the tech sector. We were just following the standard operating procedure." But as his frantic excuses echoed off the glass walls, the video on the screen silently looped behind him. It showed him buttoning his bespoke suit jacket and walking away from a failing system that protected human lives. The visual evidence made his words sound like the hollow, desperate lies of a cornered criminal. Everett Sloan did not scream. He did not fight. He simply stared at the ripped contracts on the table. With a trembling hand, he picked up a spare pen from the mahogany wood and signed the single sheet of paper the Aldervale representative slid toward him, officially surrendering absolute control of the empire he had built. Within 20 minutes, the people who had laughed at me, the executives who had believed they possessed the power to permanently destroy my career, were escorted out of their own building. They were stripped of their keycards. They could not even log into their company email accounts to call their spouses. As the dust settled in the empty boardroom, the managing director from Aldervale Capital approached me. He offered me a staggering salary, asking me to stay and become the new public face of Crown Edge Response Solutions, to help them restore municipal trust and rebuild the architecture from the inside out. I politely declined. I had no interest in wearing the crown of a conquered kingdom. I packed my encrypted drive into my bag. I told him I was leaving to establish an independent auditing firm, a specialized agency dedicated to helping cities, counties, and rural hospitals brutally test their public utility networks before they ever signed a contract with a company like this one. I walked out of the corporate headquarters and stepped into the cool evening air of Denver. The city lights were just beginning to turn on, illuminating the streets and the neighborhoods that relied on the invisible digital nets we built. I had won, but the most beautiful, satisfying revenge of this entire ordeal was not standing in that boardroom and screaming louder than the men who tried to break me. The ultimate retaliation was remaining perfectly silent, stepping back, and letting the exact moment they proudly stood up and walked away become the definitive evidence that caused the arrogant empire they built to completely collapse right in front of their eyes. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and share this video so that this story can reach many more people.